Today's reading is taken from the book of Luke, chapter 14, verses 1 to 14. This section of the reading is titled, Jesus at a Pharisee's House. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. Then Jesus asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. When Jesus noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this person your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take a least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, hey, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Then Jesus turned and said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you have a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Here ends our reading for today.
Hello. I'm never too sure whether it's you who's welcoming me or I'm welcoming you. Who should do it today? You, because you welcome me into your home or wherever you are, and I, because I'm welcoming into what you, I imagine, is hoping will be a time of reflective worship. So, either way, between the two of us, and going between the two of us, is the Spirit of God that makes our welcomes rich. So welcome. You would have listened a moment ago to the reading set down for today from Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 14. I hope you listen quite carefully, because there's some detail in here that I want to refer to. But more than that, there's always, with Jesus, more going on than it appears. In this reading, it sounds like he's giving a little bit of advice on etiquette, the kind of thing my mom used to say to me before I was going off to a social event. You know, don't take the most important seat. Behave, be humble. Take the lower seat, and then maybe they'll invite you further up. That's what it says here. That's what Jesus said, but we can be sure that he wouldn't have been wasting his breath on a little bit of etiquette advice. Much more going on here. Because those words about not taking the high seat, taking the lower seat, were followed by the kicker in this passage. Those who exalt themselves will be made humble, and those who are humble will be exalted. And you see, we have in this passage that story, that moment at this dinner party where those who exalt themselves were badly humbled. And that little incident with the man with dropsy, today apparently it's called edema, He would have had swellings and pain and certainly discomfort. That little moment happened at this dinner party, and it was immediately after that that Jesus spoke about, don't take the higher seat, go to the lower seat. And so in all these things, there is always more going on than it appears. You see, this man with edema, he has an interesting detail. I don't know whether you noticed it when Ken was reading the passage. He stood before Jesus. A moment before that, you would have heard that the Pharisees were keeping an eye on Jesus. They were watching him carefully. This man wasn't watching Jesus carefully. He was making sure that Jesus was watching him. There's a big difference between keeping an eye on Jesus like a spectator at a sports event and making sure that Jesus has his eye on you, making yourself available for him to see you, and that made all the difference in the story. So, here's this man, he's wandered into the dinner party, he's not an invitee. He stands before Jesus, and you know, I know, everybody at the dinner party knew, including Jesus, what was about to happen. This is where the background music in the movie would be going. Ken, do you have the sound? No, I'll make the sound. Bum, 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 bum. There would have been, the whole room would have just gone silent. Everybody watching to see what Jesus was going to do. And so Jesus, knowing that he was going to do what the man with the edema had hoped he would do, knows also what the consequences of him doing that, of him healing him on the Sabbath, in the company of Pharisees, what the consequences were going to be. So he asks a question. Do you think it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Well, to their credit, the Pharisees are silent because they've been confronted with a truth to argue against which would just be foolish, would be to, as we like to say these days, start digging a hole that you'd have to keep on digging, and better not to. So they are silent because they're confronted with a truth, and it's not the truth that they portray. It's not the truth that they insist on. What they insist on is the law, and on the Sabbath there's certain things you can't do and certain things you can do, and that's what they insist on. But they fail to see what the law pointed to, and that is the law is there to direct us to the way of love. And so they don't say anything. And Jesus follows, so then Jesus heals the man, as you heard, and then what follows from that is that Jesus then says, well, listen, if you had a son who fell into the well on a Sabbath, or an oxen, which is your commercial vehicle without which your business isn't going to happen, fell into the well on the Sabbath, would you leave them there because the Sabbath rule says you can't do anything like that to pull them out, or would you save them? Again, they say nothing. And you see what is happening here is, if somebody after the party was telling their friend what had happened and said that when Jesus asked these questions, the Pharisees had nothing to say, they kept silence, the friend would say, never! A Pharisee keeping silent, are you joking? The Pharisees always have something to tell you about what to do and what not to do. They kept silent. And what was abundantly clear is that what Jesus had to give this man from who he was, the Pharisees had nothing to give this man in need. Nothing that they had could help him, because what they had was the empty shell of the law. What Jesus had was the love of God. And so the man who made sure that Jesus was looking at him was a wise man. And that's something for us to think about. How often, each week, each day, do you make sure that Jesus has availability, has open availability to look into you and to know your need and to meet your need. There's a word about the Pharisees. I'm coming to a point at the moment we need to consider more about that saying of Jesus, those who exalt themselves will be humbled. But just a word about the Pharisees. The Pharisees and Jesus actually were much closer than we generally have the impression of. Because the Pharisees had a mission, and that was to prepare Israel for the coming of God and the completing of God's work, for the re-establishment, the recreation of the planet and life. And the way they went about it, however, so that goal was very similar to Jesus' goal. Jesus was looking for a purity of life. They were looking for a purity of life. What made them different and what made them clash was that the Pharisees' way of looking to get Israel into a purity of life was completely external. Was if you're ticking the boxes of what the law required, of what religion required, if you're going to church and reading your Bible and ticking the boxes, you're going to have nothing to offer to the man with the edema. Isn't it true? Jesus' way of making Israel pure and the world pure was a transformation of character, was a transformation of heart. And so it's not a lesson in etiquette. Choose the lower seat and then you might be invited up. It's a directive. If you want to find your way into the kingdom of heaven, transform your character. For those who are exalted will be made humble, will be humiliated, and those who are humble will be exalted. We need to think a little bit more about what this humiliation is and was in Jesus' day. When I was thinking about the humiliation, it's a strong word, humiliation. It's stronger than humble, but Jesus used the word humiliation when he said that the guests might come who actually had the value, not the pretension of value. You'll be humiliated. My mind went to the Second World War. And all of those stories about people in those French towns and villages who had collaborated with the Nazis, who had believed Hitler's lie of the 1,000-year Reich, who decided on the basis of that lie that actually their future was with Hitler, that would be their best life, who collaborated and not only did what the Nazis told them to do, but just started to act like the Nazis acted. Informing, jailing, even killing. And then, of course, the day came when the truth arrived with the liberators, that this wasn't a 1,000-year Reich. This was something founded on lies, on death, on destruction. It wasn't a future. And that truth arrived with the liberators, and what followed, and that's what I had in my mind, was shame, humiliation, and much worse. So that people who survived the moments of exposure and capture thought it best to go and live somewhere else, anonymously as they could, but not to be in their hometown, expelled. And that is what Jesus has in mind. Because, and it might sound to you as it sounds to me, I nearly cut this out. I nearly cut that illustration out because it sounded a bit too melodramatic, but in truth I want to show you that I don't think it's over-dramatizing what the humiliation is at all because of what happened next at this party. So it's not in our reading, but in the verses that follow, from verse 15 through to verse 24, what follows really exposes how bad this is. And what followed was that Jesus had said, after he had said those who would be exalted would be humbled, and those who were humble would be exalted. After he said that, he said to the Pharisees, because he's not vengeful here. He's not angry here. He's actually wanting to show people the way to the kingdom of heaven and to expose the falsehood, the false authority of the Pharisees, of their lording their Bible knowledge over others, but having nothing to give them in terms of the quality of their life. He said to them, listen, when you invite guests, so now he has another little bit of advice coming through. When you invite guests, don't invite those who will invite you back. You'll have your repayment then. Invite those who will not be able to invite you back. The poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind, not able to earn money, not able to throw parties, and invite them, you see. And then it seems some overly pious guest, maybe a Pharisee, we're not told, somebody said, Jesus, blessed is the man who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God. Luke tells us Jesus replied. Jesus replied. He didn't just think, I want to tell them a parable now. He replied to that statement. Blessed is the man who will eat the feast in the kingdom of heaven. He replied by telling a parable. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I want to tell you how the words of the parable end. The words of the parable end, I tell you, not one of those men who were invited will get a taste of my banquet. Okay? So the man at the actual banquet says, blessed are those who will eat the feast. Jesus' reply is, not one of those invited will even get a taste of the banquet. Everybody in the room knew, again, as much as they knew that Jesus was going to heal the man with dropsy, they knew who he was talking about, and that was the people in the room. That's very direct, that's very rough, isn't it? Blessed is those who will eat. Basically we know it's us. None of you who are invited will even have a taste of the banquet. It's very straight. And so what was the parable? The parable, you'll be familiar with it, I'm sure. It's a well-known one of Jesus saying that a man held a major banquet. He invited the guests, the honored people, and one by one they sent messages back with his messenger to say, all is ready, come, saying, oh, look, sorry, man, I bought a field and I need to go and see it. Another one said, I've just bought oxen. That's the equivalent of, my machinery for my business. I need to go and try it out. So I'd love to come, but I can't now. Another one said, I've just got married, and so on, sending in their reasons why they couldn't come. The man, said Jesus, was very angry, and so he sent his servants out and he said, listen, go into the streets and the byways and invite, and here you hear what he is just saying before he told the parable, the poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind. Invite all of the outcasts to come. So the messenger does that. He comes back. He said, we've still got space. He says, well, go out and force them to come. And I'm assuming that what was going on there was that there were people, and you might be one of those. Certainly, I know, I don't think I would have been, but I do have friends who might have said, listen, man, I can't go to that guy's house. I mean, look at me. No. He wants you there. You come, because he wants you there. And so they came. And then, who's there at this banquet, parable banquet? All of those that the Pharisees wouldn't have had at their banquet. And then Jesus makes a shocking point. You think you're invited, let me tell you, you won't even taste the king's banquet. Very straight. And what would have been, I mean, we know Jesus, this is not the only time that Jesus said things like this. If you go forward into Luke chapter 18, you'll see, again, a parable I'm sure you'll know, about Jesus said, this is what Luke tells us, Jesus said this to people who were overly confident that they had this whole thing about God and heaven waxed, you know. And he said to them, well, two people went up to the temple to pray. One was a Pharisee, one was a tax collector. The Pharisee said, oh God, thank God I'm not like other people, especially not like this guy. And then he listed the box ticks that you and I know well in our religious life. I do this, I do that, I don't do the other. Thank God I'm like this, you know, because aren't I going to be in the feast? It's not in that part of the parable. Aren't I just going to be invited to the feast? And then there's the tax collector beating his breast he's saying the Jesus prayer. I'll tell you about that in a moment. He's saying, oh God, have mercy on me, a sinner. He's like the man with the dropsy. He's saying, take a look at me, Lord. You can take a look at me. The warts and all, the good, the bad, the ugly. Have a look. It's who I know myself to be. And I throw myself on your mercy. And then Jesus says, when he's told that parable, which one of the two do you think was justified in the eyes of God when he went home? In fact, Jesus, they often put it as a question in Luke 18, doesn't put it as a question. He said, this latter one would have been the one who was justified in the eyes of God when he went home. He will be the one who's invited to the feast. And so, remember where this parable that Jesus told at the feast in Luke 14, at the dinner party. Isn't it going to be wonderful when we eat? No one here will taste. That's a shocker to me. That to me is the undressing, the exposure of the Nazi collaborators in a French village. Shocking, humiliating. We, who are in fact on a mission to make Israel ready for when God comes and the banquet of the kingdom of heaven is open, and it will be to those who, like us, have fulfilled the letter of the law. And Jesus is saying, you've got it wrong. When this man with the dropsy came into your house, you had nothing to give him. You had nothing in your house. There was no feast you could prepare. How can you expect to be in the feast of the kingdom of heaven? It's a tough message. So, you, like me, might be saying, but hang on, Errol. I'm no Pharisee. How does this apply to me? That's what we need to look at next. So now we come to, we're not talking about the Pharisees anymore. I'm talking about you and me. And how this teaching of Jesus, which at first just appeared like a little bit of advice about etiquette, and turns out to be an essential teaching about finding our way into the kingdom of heaven. Essential teaching. Not easy though. Somebody that I expect will be eating in the feast of the kingdom of heaven, who I find extraordinarily dependable and wise after many years of living the life and struggling with it as we all do. Tom Keating, he said this, I've never forgotten it when I first read it, that this way into the kingdom of heaven, this following of Christ, is not like a career or a successful path. It is a series of humiliations of the false self that become more and more profound. A series of humiliations of the false self that become more and more profound. But in this way, and I would add out of my struggles with this, in this way, and depending how we react to the humiliations of the false self we suffer, we make space within ourselves for the Spirit of God to heal, restore, and create the kind of person that can do the things that Jesus did. So, the first thing then would be, how well do you know yourself? You know, do you recognize that there's a false self that you portray? And I'm speaking to you, but believe me, I'm speaking from my own experience. Because I don't think there's anyone on earth who doesn't have a vestige, at least, of a false self. Because I don't think there's anyone on earth who has been loved properly and fully. And in the absence of the fullness and the full experience of love, that is when we start to project a self that we think will be the self that will get us the love we're missing. That makes sense to me. I hope it does to you. That's where the false self begins to be birthed. In our need for significance, in our need for love, and in the recognition that in the harshness of life and growing up, we haven't always been the person who got that, and so we have to manufacture. We have to create a self that we think will get that. And that's the false self. That when it's humiliated, creates some space for the indwelling Spirit, depending how we react to the humiliation. The humiliations I'm talking about, you and I both know this, I'm sure, that we've been in situations with people where, or we've recognized after we've been in situations with people that we were actually not being true, that we were not being honest. We wanted to say yes, but we said no. We wanted to say no, but we didn't say yes. Or we didn't say anything at all, or we said too much. Or what we said, those who knew us best knew that wasn't true to who we are. And whether the humiliation then comes in the moment, in the situation, or whether it comes it's at 3 a.m. in the morning when we wake up and we just know, yeah, that wasn't me. I know that wasn't me. Those are the humiliations. And it's how we react to them that makes the space for the Spirit or not. And what I mean by this is, I know within my own life, when I've been exposed as not being true, just not being true, I've wanted to say, oh no, but really, you know this, don't you? If it only happened because of this and that, or it only happened because he did this or that, and in one way or another I'm saying, listen, this is not really part of me. This is not who I am. I'm one destined for the highest, for the table of honor. I don't have this lower seat stuff in me. And so we seek to deal with the false self by not allowing the humiliation to teach us anything. I hope I'm making sense here. I hope that makes sense. Jesus spoke about this. If you have a look in Luke chapter 11, Jesus is saying those famous words about, no one lights a lamp and then puts it under the table, remember? And then he said, if you light a lamp, you put it so that the light can shine. And then he went on to say in Luke 11 that our eyes are the lamp of our body. And when our eyes are good, when we see what is true, the whole body is filled with light. When our eyes are bad, he said, when we look at that which is false, the whole body is filled with darkness. So far so good. But now he says this. Here's the kicker. Now he says this. Be sure. He doesn't say you, but he's saying, you be sure. This is your work, not his work. This is our work. Be sure that the light in you is not darkness. Be sure that the light that is in you is not darkness. Don't be fooled. Don't ever say to yourself, there's no false self in me. Know the difference between light and darkness within yourself. Know the truth about who you are. Let that be exposed when you go up to the temple to pray, oh Lord, here I am. Have a deep look. I don't mind it. I want you to see who I really am. And then do you see that when Jesus says, those who exalt themselves will be humiliated and those who are humble will be exalted. In the actual moment of humiliation, it sounds like that's punishment. No, it's not punishment. What it is the opportunity to learn what the humiliation is telling you and me, and to make space for the Spirit of God to make us different. It's a moment to learn. It's not a moment of punishment. It feels like it, and that's probably why we want to defend ourselves and say, well, I didn't do anything wrong. It's a moment to learn, to make space for the Spirit. When I was thinking of this, I remembered when I was working with banking executives. These guys were, riding the wave, and coaching them into being better leaders in responding positively to the negative parts of the feedback they would get. One of the things we did was that we took them into a cookery school. Sometimes some of them had some skill. Most of the time, none of them had any skill in the cookery school. And what they didn't know as well, that the cookery school was owned and run by a Jewish lady from Joburg, and she took no prisoners. She was in her 60s. She took no prisoners. And what the fellows, men and women who went into the kitchen, the person they took into the kitchen was on a hiding to humiliation. When they took the bank executive into the kitchen where their skills and competencies weren't going to have much currency, they were on a hiding to humiliation as long as they affected the business exec in the kitchen. And humiliation is what followed. Not only in the things they didn't get right, but in the things when they disregarded some of the hygiene rules, etc., etc. Humiliation followed. And in the working out in the afternoon, then what had happened, you could tell who were the good leaders and who were the mediocre leaders, because there were those who simply kept saying, yes, but if it was, but she was obviously, and yes, but the situation's contrived, and yes, but I wouldn't have been like this if it wasn't for it. Very clear that those were the people who were unable to become better leaders than they were today, who were unable to make progress on the way to being better leaders. And those who were able to say, sure, that was terrible. And I was terrible, because we showed them a video, the whole thing's video. Now they watch the video. What? Terrible. I said, geez, I was terrible. I've learned so much today. So when hello Ken, when Tom Keating says the path in following Jesus is a series of humiliations of the false self, it's not a series of punishments. It's a series of opportunities to build our character by embracing the humiliation, by asking what happened there, and making space for the Spirit of God to come in. So, friends, this is where I want to end, and that is at this point here. You see, although the Pharisees and Jesus were on the same sort of mission, the process of achieving the outcome was so completely different. The Pharisees were about ticking boxes, doing things, doing the right things, keeping the law. Jesus was talking about a transformation of your character and mine. A transformation of the character such that at the next social event to which we go, at this Pharisee's dinner party. It's not that we will remember to be a good Christian and choose the humblest seat, because that's what a good Christian would do. And we would remember that and secretly hope we are going to get invited up. It would be about the fact that you and I have become the sort of person, the sort of character who loves being in the cheapest seats, who loves being at the end of the table, furthest from the table of honor, who loves being with the people who sit in the lowest seats at the dinner party. Remember, people were always, the authorities were always horrified that Jesus was hanging out with outcasts and sinners. Why is he always with outcasts and sinners? Because he loved to be with them. That transformation of character is a very different thing to remembering to do the Christian things. It's not about doing certain things. It's about becoming a sort of person, the person who was like Jesus, the person who humbled himself, as it says in Philippians chapter 2, gave up all that he had to be amongst whoever he found, the lowliest, those who are of least important, to love to be with them, so that we don't remember to do this or that. We simply, out of who we are in our heart, are humble and find our way into the kingdom of heaven because of our ability to embrace the moments of humiliation and to make space for the Spirit. I think it's something like that. It's not a lesson in etiquette. It's a lesson in transformation of character on the path to entering the kingdom of heaven.